Good morning again. It's always an exciting day when we have a baptism. Our first reading this morning is a poem from the Irish poet Padraig Ó Tuama. That's an approximation of the name. I've probably mispronounced it. But it's called How to Be Alone, and it is a brief treatise on figuring out how to love yourself no matter what circumstances you're in. And we actually have a video an animated video with the poet reading it himself. So we'll hear it in his voice. Nothing lasts forever, so you might as well practice being alive. If anybody needs to practice kissing on their arm during church, it's okay. We welcome that here. You are such an interesting conversation. The assigned Bible reading for this morning comes from the prophet Jeremiah. This is chapter 29 in the book. It starts off like this. These are the words of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the remaining elders among the exiles and to the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. That was just one verse. It was a mouthful. So I'm going to back up and give a little bit of context on this. You might remember that the story of the Hebrew people starts with a couple named Sarah and Abraham. Yes, I am going back all the way that far, though I'm not going through the name changes part. You didn't know you were getting a tour of Bible history this morning. Don't worry, I'm not going to read the entire Hebrew scriptures to you, just a couple of highlights. The story starts with this couple, Sarah and Abraham, hearing God tell them to leave their homeland and all that was familiar to them and head to a new place where God would establish a special relationship with them that would make them a blessing for all of the earth. So they did that, uprooted themselves, went on the move, became the founding ancestors of the Hebrew people. Generations later, see, I told you I was going to skip parts. Generations later, the Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt, and then they escaped. They wandered through the desert wilderness for 40 years, and then they entered into and settled in the land that would become Israel. But it was Israel as a single united nation for only a brief period of time under the leadership of King David. Within a generation, it fragmented into two different nations, Israel and Judah. In 722 BCE, the northern kingdom, Israel, was conquered by the Assyrian Empire. Judah hung on its own for a bit over another century. But as the end of the 7th century BCE approached, the Babylonian Empire became closer and more threatening. This was the period when the prophet Jeremiah lived and wrote. Sometime around 598 BCE, the Babylonian Empire laid siege to Judah, to the city of Jerusalem. The king died in that siege, and his son assumed the throne, but then was deposed and replaced with another king. The deposed king and part of the ruling class were carried into exile in Babylon. I've said it before, but Game of Thrones ain't got nothing on the Bible. Those exiles are the folks who are addressed in the letter of Jeremiah, and this part, this mouthful of the verse from our assigned reading. A bit over a decade later, the country would attempt an ill-advised rebellion against Babylon. Babylon would come in and actually destroy the temple, destroy the city of Jerusalem, and carry off the rest of the people into exile, except for those who fled into Egypt and actually dragged the prophet Jeremiah along with them. But this part of the book of Jeremiah is from that liminal period, the in-between time, when there was exile and change, but not a clear sense of what came next. So then, these are the words of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the remaining elders among the exiles, to the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. And there are a couple of verses about how the letter got from Jeremiah to those people in Babylon. before telling us what the letter actually said, which was, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I've sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." You kind of wonder what might come next, right? This is what God is saying to all of you exiles, the kind of scolding that God's about to put on them. But this is what it said. "Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Get married and start families. Find spouses for your children to get married so they can start families. Multiply there and do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." The exiles found themselves in a surprising space, I think. And I put out a call this week asking folks to send me their stories of finding themselves in surprising places. I didn't get too many of them, and that's okay. But if you come up with something, I would still love to hear the surprising place you have found yourself in. I'm not positive how I would have answered that question, but as someone for whom a sense of direction is not among my natural gifts, I could undoubtedly come up with lots of stories of wrong turns, missed exits, cities I found myself in without meaning to, new neighborhoods that I discovered because I never seem to know where I'm going. Sometimes even Google Maps takes me to the wrong place. Heck, in September, I visited a friend in apartments down by Wayne Junction, and I got lost trying to find my way back out of the building. To be fair, it's a very weird rehabbed building. And there was another person with me. So we fought off the wizards and the monster. No, I swear, I thought I got into one of those bad movies where the hallways all change after you walk through them. But I made it. I'm here. There are other kinds of surprising places that we find ourselves, not just by getting ourselves lost. Friday, I was surprised to find myself in McMenamin's Tavern in the middle of the day when I had a stack of papers I definitely need to grade and a sermon that I hadn't finished writing yet. But the Phillies were in their first playoff game for 11 years, and I promised my friend Jim that I would watch the game with him if they made it. I was also surprised to still find myself there after 8 frustrating innings to hear all of the cheering when they scored 6 runs in the 9th. I got home that day to another image of someone in a surprising place. My wife showed me cell phone video of one of our 2 cats sitting at the back door looking very full of rage as one of the neighborhood cats was lying against the screen door, soaking up the sunshine. That's not the surprising part. I called this cat the Slayer because I lost count of how many times I've seen it playing with and then eating mice in our yard, which, hey, good job. The less of them make it to our walls, the better, I think. As my wife's cell phone video went on and our cat was looking rage-filled and frustrated, I noticed suddenly that one of the squirrels who comes into our yard, always looking for food, had its nose to the ground, looking and looking and looking, until it realized it was practically nose to nose with the Slayer. And the Slayer must have been full of mice already because that very lucky squirrel backed itself up to a tree and made it up out of the tree and back out of the yard. Sometimes the surprise is that you're terrified and you still survive. Sometimes the surprise is that the place you find yourself is more hospitable than you expected. That's what Becky Jamros wrote to me and said about her old age. Let me give it to you in the words that she sent to me. She said, "I have been surprised by the joy of being old. I don't feel old, but I know that I'm definitely in that demographic. At this stage in life, I am happier, more peaceful, and enjoying the freedom to create and explore more than ever before. I live in gratitude for the opportunity to make every moment a new beginning." She's found old age to be a territory where she can thrive. I got a story from Mary Trace to Mary. Thank you for that story. I couldn't figure out quite how to work it in, but it involves planes, trains, automobiles, and being separated from Ed in Germany with no money and no ability to speak the language. You should definitely ask her about it. It's a wonder that she's here. We find ourselves in places. That's the way of life, the way of time. We can also say maybe it's the way of the Spirit. We find ourselves places. And sometimes those places are exactly where we planned to be. Sometimes they're very different from what we hoped. Sometimes they're the result of clear work and intention and scheduling. Sometimes they're just the way that life carried us. The thing to know is that we're not alone in any of it, even when we're at our most uncertain. The story of Israel is one that holds a lot of these surprises. For a sacred story that's built on the promise of a particular place and land, there's a lot of in-between time that makes up Israel's story. As we saw earlier, the story begins in wandering. Sarah and Abraham and all of their household packing up from one place, heading to another with nothing but a promise and a prayer. Quite a lot of their story takes place in the in-between, those in-between spaces. And then if the generations in Egypt feel like a diversion from the story of a promised place and being a blessing, the generations after escape from Egypt are every bit as confounding. That promise and a prayer were feeling pretty thin once they got into the wilderness and realized they didn't know where they were going or what they were going to eat along the way. 40 years in an in-between place sort of starts to feel like maybe the in-between is all there is. Can you relate to that? Of course, they did settle the land. And then, as we saw, they were unsettled from it as well. If there's one thing to take away from the story of Israel, and there are lots of things to take away from the story of Israel, but one thing that maybe we can take away from it this morning, it's that the promises are eternal, but the circumstances will change. As Padre Gautama said, so you might as well practice living. Certainly those, yes?
Something's going on with the microphones going in and out for people on Zoom. Can you use that?
Okay. Okay, better? All right, we'll move back. So they did settle the land. We saw they were unsettled. I got there already. So those exiles that Jeremiah sent his letter to, they must have felt a sense of whiplash. Just what in the world was going on? How did they find themselves in a new home that was not their promised home? And just what were they supposed to do now in this place of exile? I wonder if we can sympathize with that at all. Maybe even find ourselves in that feeling or find that feeling inside of us. I mean, these are strange times that we are living in. And I'm not just talking about climate disaster and the slow motion unraveling of democracy, though another plug for Power's Get Out the Vote events coming up. But I mean closer to home, less out there and more in here. We are at an interesting time in our congregational life. A number of things happened in a short period of time that might have left us feeling a bit of whiplash. The biggest and most obvious was that we said goodbye to Linda Noonan at the end of April, not quite 6 months ago. She had been here longer than almost everyone in the room. I know there are at least there are a handful of folks who predated Linda's pastorate here. But she was here for 21 years. Her fingerprints are all over a lot of the ways we think about ourselves and how we do things and how we understand ourselves. And we gave her a beautiful send-off, but her own family stuff, including her father's illness and death, meant that she was gone for a lot of the time leading up to her departure. So the kinds of processing that you'd like to do in a big pastoral transition like that, a lot of that processing, that wasn't really available to us here. It was complicated and abbreviated. So there is rightly some grief here over that. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I don't think so. I'm not certain that we've named it well or given it enough space. So I at least want to name it here. And then we ordained Priscilla and gave me a new title, and those were very exciting things. And we went right into the intense work of a budget-making season, and then I disappeared for a 2-month sabbatical, which was maybe less than ideal timing, except that it had already been delayed for a year, and it was pretty necessary for my mental health. So I remain grateful for that space that you gave me. Therapists know, I'm not a therapist, by the way, but I'll speak on behalf of all therapists here. Therapists know that when that much big stuff happens in a short amount of time, even when it's a mix of good stuff with the hard stuff, that much change in a short period of time can be a recipe for depression. It's a lot to handle. It's disorienting. It takes a lot to regain your bearings. Add to that all the fact that we are still climbing our way out of a pandemic that shut the world down for a couple of years, made it really complicated to be together. And it gave us the wonderful gift of our hybrid worship setup and the gift of finding new ways to be community with people across the distance. But it also still has left a lot of folks trying to figure out what their relationship is anymore to church, to institutions in general, to the prior rhythms of everyday life. People have so many old and now new obligations laid on them all at once, and there's an undercurrent of anxiety in our social life at large. It's more important than ever and more confusing than ever to figure out how to be church to and with each other. That's why I'm grateful for Jeremiah and for those captives who'd been carried off into exile in Babylon. I'm grateful to whomever had the foresight to save that letter so that we could read it these generations later. Those folks in Babylon, they weren't in dire circumstances, not when that letter came. They were given jobs. They had homes that they were living in. They had pretty good accommodations for their lives, but they weren't home. They weren't the place that was familiar, the place that they knew, the place where they felt in control of the situation, the place that felt like their place. They were carrying grief in a place where they felt disoriented. It's worth naming that, because maybe it's our feeling as well. But then this message, build homes, start families, pray for the city you're in, whatever that city is, it feels so hopeful and life-giving and truth-telling and so crucial. Love where you are, even if it's not where you expected to be. Invest in it. Care for each other. Attend to your relationships. Feel your feelings. Hold on to each other. Know that something new will come along, and live in such a way that you'll be ready when that something new becomes clear. Live in trust and hope, even in exile, because God is the God of exile too, the God of the in-between. Wherever we are, the expected places, the familiar places, the unexpected and the unfamiliar, the Spirit is already there, moving in us, moving among us. And this is God's good news. Amen.